Mr. Clerk, next item.
Mr. Speaker, the Senate is on item number 15, Senate Bill 1380 by Senator Bell.
Senator Bell, you're recognized on Senate Bill 1380.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In order to bring forth an amendment that makes the bill, I move Senate Bill 1380 on third and final consideration.
That's a proper motion by Senator Bell on Senate Bill 1380. Consideration, third and final consideration, proper seconded. Mr. Clerk, amendments.
Amendment number 1 by the Senate Judiciary Committee.
Chairman Bell, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Amendment number 1 does make the bill, and the bill as amended, it comes from some work done over the summer to analyze and improve law enforcement's use of force policies. Back on July 2nd, on 2020, Governor Bill Lee announced a partnership with Tennessee Association of Chiefs of Police, the Tennessee Sheriff's Association, the TBI, the Tennessee Department of Safety, and the Tennessee Highway Patrol, the Tennessee Department of Commerce and Insurance, and the Tennessee Peace Officers Standards and Training Commission to look at and enhance policies to improve information sharing and increase officer training. This partnership resulted in the Governor's Use of Force Policy Committee, which issued recommendations on September 10th, 2020, in the form of sample use of force policy for law enforcement agencies to adopt across the state. This bill, or this amendment that makes the bill, seeks to codify those best practices to ensure that the men and women of law enforcement continue to excel in the role of keeping Tennesseans safe. Mr. Speaker, with that explanation, this is a section-by-section breakdown. Section 1 prohibits chokeholds unless an officer reasonably believes that deadly force is authorized. And that would be the same reasonable belief that deadly force could be authorized in any situation. Defines chokehold as an intentional use of pressure or constriction to the neck, throat, or windpipe intended to inhibit breathing. That's Section 2. Section 3 requires the proper use of chokeholds to be taught at law enforcement training academies. Section 4 is on de-escalation. It requires each law enforcement agency to develop a policy regarding de-escalation, requires each agency to provide training to officers on de-escalation techniques. Requires a law enforcement officer to intervene when an officer has an opportunity and means to prevent harm from occurring due to excessive use of force. Requires a law enforcement officer to report the excessive use of force to a supervisor. Prohibits a law enforcement agency from retaliating against any officer who intervenes against or reports excessive use of force. Also addresses shooting at moving vehicles. Prohibits discharging a firearm at or from a vehicle unless the officer reasonably believes that deadly force is authorized. In use of force reporting, requires each law enforcement agency to establish and use a use of force reporting system, and requires each law enforcement agency to report monthly to TBI all use of force data required by the FBI. TBI shall then compile the data and report to the General Assembly. And then Section 5 prohibits a magistrate or a judge from issuing a no-knock warrant. Mr. Speaker, that's an explanation of Amendment 1 that makes the bill.
You've heard explanation of Amendment number 1. Questions on Amendment number 1 that makes the bill? Senator Gilmore, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I wanted to commend the sponsor. I think that this is a good step in the right direction. I did want to ask one thing, though. In your first, amendment, when you talk about unless the officer believes that deadly force is authorized, what does that phrase mean? In what circumstances would it be authorized? Is that authorized by the law, or if the officer feels like it's necessary to use chokeholds? Could you explain that, please?
Senator Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, the use of deadly force by law enforcement officers is already defined in what circumstances it can be used in 3911-620. And again, this would be the same circumstances that would allow an officer to fire a weapon if he thought deadly force should be used. And so it is defined currently in code. 3911-620 says a law enforcement officer, after giving notice of the officer's identity as such, in other words, he has to identify who he is or she is, may use or threaten to use force that is reasonably necessary to accomplish the arrest of an individual suspected of a criminal act who resists or flees from arrest. Notwithstanding subsection A, the officer may use deadly force, again, be it a weapon or be it a chokehold, which this is the only exception, a chokehold could be used if the officer believes deadly force is justified. He may use deadly force to effect an arrest only if all other reasonable means of apprehension have been exhausted or are unavailable, and where feasible, the officer has given notice of the officer's identity as such and given a warning that deadly force may be used unless resistance or flight ceases. And the officer has probable cause to believe that the individual to be arrested has committed a felony involving the infliction or threatened infliction of serious bodily injury, or the officer has probable cause to believe that the individual to be arrested poses a threat of serious bodily injury either to the officer or to others unless immediately apprehended. So that's the current code. Well, this bill does nothing to change that. That's the current code defining what deadly force is, and those standards would have to be met for a chokehold to be used.
With that, let's pause just a moment and get this amendment, get it in proper order. Senator Bell moves amendment number 1 to Senate Bill 1380. Proper second on that. Now we have that in proper form before us. Apologize for that, Senator Bell. Senator Gilmore, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Sponsor, does this change the use of the new, should this bill be voted on, does it change the use of chokehold in any way from what's presently being used?
Senator Bell, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It does, with the language of this bill, it does say that those factors would have to be present in order for them to be able to use a chokehold. They would have to reasonably believe that deadly force is justified.
Senator Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I apologize. Is that different than what it is presently, Mr. Sponsor?
Chairman Bell.
It's my understanding that many of the police departments around the state have policies that require that, but this puts it into code.
Senator Campbell, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to say a lot of constituents of mine have written to me in support of this bill, and I've signed on as a co-sponsor. I think it's a great bill, and I'll be voting for it.
Any additional comments or questions? Senator Yeager, we're on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to thank the sponsor of the bill for bringing it. I appreciate his leadership on this issue, and it is certainly a statement that we as a body need to make. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Any additional? Senator Hensley, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the sponsor yield?
Sponsor yields.
Does this make a police officer more liable for if they don't go by one of these or they don't de-escalate like it's in the law? Since it's policy now, but us putting it in the law, does it make them more liable to be punished if they don't do this?
Senator Bell, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It would mean they would be breaking a law if they didn't do this, whereas before it would be a policy, but this bill doesn't spell out any or doesn't have any punishment or consequence in it, but they would be breaking a law if they were not following the law, if they chose not to do this. But again, it's my understanding that these are in there as policy anyway. This bill was brought with the cooperation and not just the cooperation of, but the work of the Tennessee Sheriff's Association, Chiefs Police Association helped me with the draft of this language. And so it is the language that's in this bill is language that they're fully aware of and know that they're going to have to comply with.
Senator Hensley, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So they are able to make these policies, and so each law enforcement agency in each county, like the local sheriff's department and the city law enforcement, they will all have to come up with their own policies to match this law, or they will have I guess the state will have a policy that they can adopt, maybe all of the different law enforcement agencies in the state.
Senator Bell, you're recognized.
Part of this bill is specific that it just says you can't use a chokehold unless you believe deadly force is authorized, but then the de-escalation part requires them to develop policy. So part of it does require them to develop policies. Some of it is just what it is. It is a bill that lays out the language, and there's no flexibility for each one of them to do it. But I'll tell you that in the discussions, and we had a lot of discussions, that I believe most law enforcement agencies, both sheriffs and chief of police, had the majority of this in their policy anyway. This is just moving it to policy to code.
Any additional questions or comments for Senator Bell on amendment number 1? Seeing none, all in favor of amendment number 1 say aye. Opposed, no. We adopt. We're back on Senate Bill 1380 by Chairman Bell. Chairman Bell. Chairman Bell renews his motion on Senate Bill 1380. All in favor will vote aye when the bell rings. Those opposed vote no. Mr. Clerk. Several member voted. Swan votes aye. Mr. Clerk.
Ayes 32, no nays.
Senate Bill 1380, having received a constitutional majority, is declared passed. Without objection, the motion to reconsider goes to table.